My name is Dave Carey. I've been involved at Chickenshed Theatre for 30 years. Essentially, I was a composer and musician and joined them creating the music. As we developed our processes and methodology, although I continue to do the music, I'm also heavily involved in our training we do in inclusion. And there's a term we use in the UK a lot at the moment, which is unconscious bias. And I'm going into organisations and working with them to explore how inclusion and unconscious bias can be discussed and work within their business. So, but still, I'm a composer and artist at heart.
Could you please tell us a bit about Chickenshed Theatre?
Yeah, I can. It's probably the best way to do it is to do a very quick 2-minute history of the company. And that explores why we approach things in this inclusive way. We started life in 1970s as an after-school club for children to come and do music theatre. And then in 1981, a boy with cerebral palsy, who society would label as disabled, just arrived one day, and the young people then, of which I was one, started saying, "Where are the other disabled children? Why do we never see anyone with disability in the room?" So we started exploring why in the education system there was special schools and mainstream schools, but also after school activities were still separated into mainstream and special education. So we realised that if you were the parent of two children, one of whom had a disability, you still couldn't go to the same activity for the brother and sister to be together. They still had to be separated. So we started working with a children's home local to us, and we started bringing children from special educational needs provision together with mainstream children. So that was about in the 1980s, and it was seen as quite revolutionary, really. We referred to it then as integration, and gradually that language has changed, and we now use the word inclusion. But in 10 years' time, that word will change again. We were very fortunate in the fact that some very key people became interested in our work, and we were able to fundraise until we had the money to have our own building, our own theatre. That was always our dream, so that we could stop working in church halls and school halls. We could have our own theatre space. So that was in 1995. And then we realised that inclusion wasn't about disabled and able-bodied, that when we looked at all our members, they were all white and they were all middle class. So we started exploring how we could create theatre that genuinely and truly represented our community and our society. So we started going into deprived areas of London, so that we could engage with people from the Black and Asian and mixed ethnicity communities, that we could engage with people on a lower socially economic scale. So people living in poverty. And we became really interested in the idea that if we brought all these people together and we could genuinely hear their voices and explore their lives and what it felt like to be in their lives, that we would create something that was genuinely our community. And that became our interest. Since then, we've started education courses, which are all inclusive. So we do a degree, and we do what they call a BTEC, which is a high school diploma. And we maintain that balance of people from different backgrounds, people with different ethnicity, different abilities, and it's bringing all those voices together that creates the unique. Well, it shouldn't be unique because it's society, but it's still seen as this really unusual thing that we hear all your voices, and we are able to create using all those experiences. We do a lot of outreach work. We go into schools, particularly schools in deprived areas of London. We have a show that's been running for 10 years about knife crime, which is a particular interest in the UK. It's been a problem for many years, and gangs. So we do a lot of work in that area. We do a lot of work around bringing routes for employment for young people with disability. We use the term lived experience. So we take the lived experience of people and create theatre around that, which gives a platform and a voice for people to change their own communities. That's the heart and essence of it.
Yeah, it's really impressive to hear about the history. We were actually checking out your website, and then we found a little documentary where I think it's one of the co-founders, maybe Ward. She said that, I'm going to quote her now. She said, Chickenshed shows a glimpse of a more better world, and it gives you hope that if you can grasp for that good side of humanity and take it out, there we just might be able to change the world a bit. And I think that is just a really nice vision that, like, as you said, inclusion is something really strange for the mainstream, even though it just shows how society actually is. So our next question would be, how do you realize that Chickenshed stays true to its purpose ground of like inclusion? How do you realize that?
Well, I suppose the first starting point is there's a lot of difference between inclusion and diversity, and I think that's always a confusion. Diversity is easy to achieve. It's easy to go and make sure you've got people of different ethnicity, of different ability. Inclusion for us is when we actually are genuinely hearing those voices, and those people have a place at the table. There's a very famous inclusion quote, which is diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. But recently, we've started looking at that in a completely different way, because real inclusion is actually planning the party yourself. It's not being invited to it. It's taking away the power from yourself and giving that power to the people in the room. And I think so much has come out of the Black Lives Matter campaign of the last year that it's changing everyone's thinking about what genuine inclusion is. So provided you're creating an environment in a space where people feel safe to express themselves, provided you're creating that sense that every voice is heard, that if one of our young people has an idea, we don't just say, oh, thanks, that's great. We act on it, and we use that idea. And for a lot of people, whether they are from a disabled background or whether they're from social economic backgrounds, it might be the first time in their life someone has gone, yes, that's great. And that's a really powerful tool for change, because we in our education system, and I know Germany well, and we're similar in cultural terms and similar in educational terms. We still, I think Western education wishes to fail children immediately. We the moment we can say you're not good at that, that's what we want to do. And for us, the way we ensure that inclusion remains core to our principles is we don't fail people. And however many times they may fail themselves because society has driven that into them, we throw open the rule book and say, no, that's fine, you come back. That's the essence of it for us.
It is. You've said it beautifully that there's a slight difference between inclusion and diversity. So my next question would be, what could many creative industries cater to build an inclusive and diverse working environment without any discrimination? What could be many specifically creative industries, because I believe we see in many creative in many creative institutions there's a lot of discrimination in terms of lack of inclusivity, so to say.
Yeah. Okay. That's a big question. You have to, in the West and in Europe, we have built systemic exclusion within our society. And that's systemic racism, that's systemic ableism, if you like to use that language. If you live in a poor estate in London, it's very difficult to get out of that estate. If you want to be if you're going to change the industry, the creative industries, and they should be the first people to embrace this. The creative industries should be the obvious place where inclusion is successful and easy to achieve. You have to do two things. You have to change the shape of the door for people to come into it, because we're all being boxed into the same system. But before you even change the shape of the door, you have to change the shape of the path that gets to the door, because there are so many obstacles and barriers on that pathway to the door. You need to, in England, if you wish to go and study creative arts, it's really still a middle class thing, and it's a middle class white thing essentially, because it's not going to be a well paid job at the end of it. It might not be a job at the end of it, and for people on different socioeconomic scales, that's simply not an option. If you've got what we would call bank of mum and dad, you've got parents that can support you, then it's easy to access the creative arts. So you have to start at that whole basis of why we are not changing things at the fundamental level of society in order to allow people into these creative industries. And that's a whole range of things need to change. So I think we've been doing a lot of work with theatre organisations in London at the moment around it. And it's astonishing that when I'll do a Zoom call similar to this, but with 30 directors, successful directors in the UK, and they are all white. There's a gender has changed undoubtedly, but they are all white. They are all middle class, and no one is disabled. And that fundamental core. There's a very close colleague of mine, Michael, who comes from a place called Tottenham in a really bad area, in trouble with the police, and he's now a senior colleague of mine. And he always said, you can't be what you can't see, and unless people start seeing representation of themselves on stage, or more importantly on the board, on the management, in the power making decisions, unless we see that diversify, then we're never going to change the industry, because if you don't know it's for you, you won't engage with it. And that's been a lot of Chickenshed's core, is to change the shape of our way of getting in. Yeah, I hope, does that answer that?
Yeah, no, that definitely set an insight of how systemic, like how the systemic base is a bit of a problem in terms of inclusivity in a more diverse creative industry.
Yeah. Moving on, could you please enlighten us how you like integrate inclusion to also create like this ethnical diverse place? Because as we saw, it's not only about people with disabilities and people with disabilities and people without disabilities, but you're also trying to provide like ethnical inclusion, or even like social inclusion, because you're also working with different social groups.
So, okay, that for us, inclusion doesn't work really until you're engaging with everyone within your community. It has to reflect your community, and London is a diverse city, and so we have to engage with those people. It has to be a fundamental core. How do we do it? It's going to sound really quite like, it's going to sound like hippies. I don't know if you know that word, but it starts with kindness. It starts with being nice to people. It starts with respecting everyone's viewpoint, everyone's opinion. It starts with ensuring that if somebody can't access it because of money, because of inability to travel, because they're in a wheelchair, that you have to then change that. So you have to make sure that the funding is in place for someone that can't afford it, that they can afford it. So we run schemes where a lot of our students come to us and they quite often won't have money for lunch. So we have a fund that makes sure that they can buy lunch. And we have a cafe, and the voucher is given to them to go and exchange it at the cafe, so that they're buying lunch. Really common at the moment is digital exclusion. Some of our young people who don't have enough data on their phone to be in a class or be in a lesson. So we're exploring how we make sure we can change that, how we can address these issues. And I think so. Yeah, kindness, respect, and a really key thing is time. People learn at different speeds. People learn in different ways, and there's you don't ask a goldfish to climb a tree, so you have to create a curriculum. You have to create a creative process that adapts your thinking to other people's thinking, rather than saying that most of our work is devised. So we create our own theatre, because there is no point in saying we're going to do Shakespeare with one of our cast members who struggles to speak. We have to find different ways to create so that person in a wheelchair can dance. That person that lives in a housing estate in Tottenham and has been selling drugs on the street corner for the last year feels the respect is there for him to come and work in a theatre. So it's time, it's kindness, it's respect, and it's good peer modelling. So we use a lot of our young people to teach our young people. So it's peer-to-peer learning. And if you enable people to learn for themselves, that is so much more powerful than telling people something. They learn it for themselves out of their own experience. Then it changes the dynamic between educator and educated, and brings it to a different scenario. I learn from our young people every day, because I don't know what it's like to live in certain areas. I don't know what it's like to be in a wheelchair, and I'm learning from them the whole time. So yeah, that's key to it for us. Time. It takes time and patience and kindness.
Yeah, you've mentioned one beautiful line or quote saying that one cannot teach a goldfish to climb a tree, and I think that's the most essence beauty of inclusion spaces such as Chickenshed. And to your perspective, what do you think are more common mistakes on many organizations approaching other thinking about inclusion? Like, what are many mistakes that many organizations probably are sidelining or avoiding, or so to say?
I think, yeah, no, it's a really good question. I think it comes back to something we mentioned earlier, that a lot of organisations think diversity is inclusion. We've employed black people, we've employed gay people, so we must be inclusive. But there's a much different process than diversity and inclusion. I think you have to change the shape of your organisation. The existing structures for a lot of companies, and I'm talking about when we work with banks and solicitors or lawyers. You have to remove this hierarchical structure and address that somehow, because it's important that if you don't feel your voice is being heard, why would you stay in a job other than to pay them rent? You have to really engage with people to give them self-value. And if you give people value and worth, they will give you value and worth back. If you don't, then they won't. And for us, that's quite a simple equation. I think I might have gone off on a different track there. Sorry.
No, totally not. You're still on the right track, because that's what where the problem also, well, is set up to be in many cases, that there is line of hierarchy that is building a bridge between and a diverse, inclusive work and creative environment.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the problem, and it's so being talked about now, is that the structures that exist see everything through a white European lens. And while we're viewing society, we know that in our schools we teach colonialism effectively, and so we are recycling the oppression. But a lot of people are saying, "Oh, but things have changed," but they haven't. It's just become more subtle and more nuanced, and that we have to address. We have to address our education system right from the very beginning as to why young people fail, why the structures are in place that are there to trip up young people and not to support them and encourage them. The pandemic has highlighted it all, because if you are, a lockdown, if you are in a house with a large garden and mum and dad pay for tutors to come online and teach you maths, the lockdown is not a big issue. If you are living in a high-rise flat with 3 brothers and sisters trying to use one old computer between you, there is no extra tuition available. You're in a wheelchair, so you can't get out of that flat so easily. Then, of course, the gap is just widening and widening and widening, and that's the real tragedy of the pandemic.
Oh yeah, it is one of these socio-economical injustices of how the scale of education in this pandemic has affected so many people in a sense that like Dave had said, that it becomes a bit difficult if a family of 3, if a family with 3 kids with just a single computer, then they have to share a single computer altogether. And you also one have to consider kids who do not have a built-in Wi-Fi at home, because there are still some incident where Wi-Fi, unkept Wi-Fi, cannot be accessible, and it also become part of the narrative of the imbalanced system.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a lot of students who, I mean, most people have a phone of some sort now, but the number of our young people who have run out of data by the second week of the month, because they're on the cheapest the package they can afford, and so you have to be so careful when we're teaching that we're not putting young people in a situation where they have to say, I can't afford that, or I haven't got the Wi-Fi, or we have to find ways around that. And it's very complex and it's very difficult. But it's so important if we're going to change the systemic injustices that exist in the world. This is a very deep conversation for Friday morning. but important conversation. Really important.
I would like to go back somehow to the structures you mentioned, like I mean, yeah, there is just a different like there's a distinct type of normal that just exists in our society, and that has been reproduced in schools and every like there's this structure, there's this system that requires like it requires you as Chickenshed to approach people with kindness and respect when they normally would not been approached in this kind of way. So we know that like a certain type of mindset is just in all of our minds, and yeah, what we're trying to is like to break through that.
Yeah.
But I would like to know what, in your opinion, are like the most challenging aspects of working in and like inclusive environment where still this kind of like mindset exists. Because I'm quite sure when you meet new people, they, I mean, not blaming them, it's just like a systematic matter that there's this mindset in ourselves.
Yeah. The first mindset to address is that I think quite often people think that we are doing some good for the disabled child, that we're doing some good for the black kid from an estate in Tottenham, that we are doing some good. And it's not. We are doing good for ourselves. And if you flip the whole thing, that inclusion is about your journey, it's about bringing everyone on that journey with you. I'm not going into a class thinking aren't I doing nicely for the disabled child? I'm not. It's all part of the same journey that you have to look inside yourself. The whole concept and you talked earlier about that within society we have these structures and these mindsets. So you've got to look at your own mindset. You've got to wonder why you automatically assume that a certain race of people or a certain demographic of people are going to behave in a certain way because that's what you've learned from early years. You look at the media in the West, and we have free media, we're always told, but a lot of our media is just recycles fear of immigrants, fear of the unknown. It's still this sense of the term I would use is othering. We other people that aren't like us, and I think until that changes, you have to change that mindset, and I think you also have to. For me, it's not a destination. It's not something. I've not arrived at inclusion. I'm still on the journey, and I've been doing it 30 years, and my colleagues and that I've been working with have been doing it for years, but we still haven't arrived. I am making mistakes every day, but you have to be comfortable with that. I think there's huge issues in our education system, but also our working environment, that no one wants the uncomfortable conversation. And some of these conversations are uncomfortable, and you've got to have those uncomfortable conversations, and it's all right to get it wrong. I think particularly for white middle class people now, there's almost a fear of saying the wrong thing. And so we're not saying anything, and that won't help either. We've got to be, and certainly if you look a lot of the social media around the Black Lives Matter movement, it is much more about you've got to be actively anti-racist. You've got to be anti the systems. It's no good saying I'm not a racist, I'm not against disabled. You've got to be actively against it and actively fighting against it. So yeah, again, there's a lot of responsibility on everybody to look inside themselves.
Yeah, that's. I think you mentioned the fear of not knowing and othering people. That is actually a great point, and the discomfort of white middle class people to talk about issues, because the fear of saying something that is completely wrong, or that's something that will go against the status quo of what is right in this world. But on a lighter note, my next question would be, could you please tell us more about a project that offers comfort? Because amongst many other things in this present time, what we need, or what I feel that more people need, is this idea of comfort, because we do not know the outcomes of the
Yeah.
pandemic. So is there like a current existing project now that offers comfort, but in a more crucial creative way?
So, yes, is the answer. We're always running lots of different projects, and a lot of it is age group based. So we might be working with the age group of 10 to 12 or 12 to 14, and each of those projects is appropriate for that age group. So a lot of our work, we try it because we've got 30 children on a Zoom call. You want it to be fun, so we will have general workshops that really are about fun and about engaging with their peers online, which is so difficult to do. How do you recreate that sense? So a lot of innovation around how we use breakout rooms, how do you teach a song online? How do you get kids up and dancing online? So we're doing a lot of that, but I think the most important project for me that I've been doing in the last 6 months has actually been to explore mental health for young people and what that means, and what that meant before the pandemic and what that means now, in order to try and create a project that we can take into schools. Those early teenage years, 13, 14, 15, is where so many issues are created that then come back in years to come. So about self-respect, about talking, about being open, about how to be open. And the statistics, there was a statistic in one of our national papers the other day about the number of I think it was 12 to 15-year-olds that had considered suicide, and it was something like 17%. So that's nearly 1 in 5 of our young people had considered killing themselves. So that society must be really wrong if that is the situation. So we've spent a long time talking to people, seeing how we can be creative with that online. I'm happy to share you a link of the outcome of that project, and it's very rough. It's not in any way, shape, or form finished because it's all online. And there was a little bit when we were in the room. There was a slight break in England with the pandemic where we were allowed to be in the room in September, October, and then we were all back at home again. But it's been a project about, and it's using song, rap, dance, script, but really letting the young people express their feelings about what mental health it means to them, so that we can take that back into schools when the pandemic ends and work with young people about mental resilience and what we would call anti-fragility, and how they combat, how they who to talk to when you're a young person experiencing depression. Are you the only one experiencing depression? Self-harm, kids cutting themselves, and that's skyrocketed under the pandemic. So it's a comforting project. The other end, it's not comforting to do because it's actually quite painful to do. But I think that's a lot of the work that we do, is actually you don't come away necessarily feeling happy, because you have to ask a lot of questions about society and yourself. But I think we're trying to create a blend where we're creating a community online where joy, happiness, fun, laughter can flourish, but also we're trying to tackle issues that, when we come out of this pandemic, can support and help those young people to take part in that journey out of lockdown, out of this extreme scenario we find ourselves in. So yeah.
Yeah, I can see that you really I can feel like a strong focus on the really like beautiful and inspiring positive outcome from like all of your projects, all of your works. Like it's really inspiring for me. But I would like to know about, I mean, as you're approaching sensitive, uncomfortable topics and issues, and like, what are some challenges or difficulties you face in your work?
So we have what we would call on a practical level, we have safeguarding systems in place. We have a counsellor who's available for any of our young people to talk to privately. We have a very strong mentoring system, and so all our young people involved in our education courses are phoned once a week by a mentor, a staff mentor, sometimes a mentor from a slightly older age group, to check in with them, to have a conversation, to see how they are. And for some kids, it's like, yeah, fine, bye. And for other kids, it's outpouring can happen of expressions of where they are. So I think that the challenges are ensuring that if a young person shuts down about something, or if a young person doesn't engage, how do we find the routes through for them to engage? And for every young person, it's different. So you have to stop teaching a curriculum and start teaching the individual, and start working with the individual, whether that's directing a show or running some education courses or some outreach work. It's about every individual in the room. You have to have the backup of services that can be available to that young person if it triggers something. And I think it is for us, and we are by now, this is what we do, but it doesn't mean to say it's the only way. But we try so hard to create a community that everyone, young or old, are engaged in. We're doing a really beautiful project, actually. This is the project I should have talked about, called Living Letters, where some of our young people are writing to people in their 70s and 80s. They are writing them letters, and we start with provocations like, if you were to see me, you would think I was. And it's the walk a mile in my shoes kind of concept, that we are getting the young people and the old people to explore through letter writing, and then eventually we bring them on to a Zoom call, and they meet for the first time in virtual world. And so we've got a disabled boy from Tottenham in a wheelchair meeting a lady in her 70s that lives in a mansion in London, and it's a hugely beautiful process. And I think there's always the assumption that we were doing this for the old people, but it's quite the reverse. It's the young people are finding so much empowerment in it to be able to step out of their community into a different community and have these conversations, and sometimes talk about, what was life like in the 60s when flower power happened, to be able to talk about what was life like before the European Union. Now we've gone back to not having a European Union for us. So lots of questions, and that kind of sense of intergenerational work is also a really important element for us. It's creating conversation, and once conversation happens, it flows, and understanding happens, and that community grows as a community.
Um, you've mentioned a lot of beautiful projects that you've been working on with Chickenshed, and many of them are so inspiring, and they challenges the socio the normality of how able beings have completely de-isolated some of the challenges that people are facing, the challenges that are not being inclusive. We do not literally have, or I feel as if the world does not have a common, inclusive, critical thinking to some of the injustices that are being are deployed. So my question, or my last question, would be, what does it mean? What does it mean to be seen and heard? No, what does it mean to be seen, heard, and most importantly, understood?
Wow. Okay. So I think just to address that, your first feelings that there isn't a common world policy around inclusion, and I think I've travelled a lot. I've worked not far from your country in Malawi and Zimbabwe, and the issues of inclusion there are so different from I work in China. The issues of inclusion in China are very different than they are in sub-Saharan Africa as they are in Europe, and I think it's never going to be a one remedy fits everyone. It's exploring how inclusion works in different cultures. I find really interesting, and how it can be addressed. There is a common thread of kindness, of openness, of warmth. Um, but sorry, I've now forgotten what your question was.
Okay, my question was, what it means to be seen, heard, and most importantly, understood.
Yeah. So I think that's a really difficult question for me to answer, because I am white, middle class, middle aged. I've always been seen. I've always been heard. I've always been understood. And I think the difficulty for a lot of people in my circumstances is to feel that if I let you be heard and understood, then that's going to take something away from me. But of course, the fact is, it will take nothing away from me to allow you to be heard and understood. So, what does it feel like to be not heard, not understood, not seen? I don't know, because it's never happened to me. But I know so many colleagues and people that I work with who experience that still every day. I can empathize, I can find ways that they can be heard, but I'm never really going to know what that feels like inside, what that feeling is. And that's really interesting. Yeah.
It's one of the most crucial and critical question, because at the same time, I'm speaking as a black a person living in Europe, and also a black person who has lived in South Africa. I also do not know how it feels like to be a seen, heard, and understood, because I'm particularly in South Africa, in a country which is 27 years into freedom, but there's still a lot of racial gap and a lot of segregated communities, where they are racially, where we are like racially placed or categorized in terms of our skin colors. So it is very a bit of a challenging question also. Hence hence I chose to ask it, because no one really knows what it feels like to be in this kind of
Yeah. And that's why it's so important that we create the environment where we can hear each other, where we can hear. Your lived experience is going to be so far from my lived experience. But to be honest, your lived experience will also be different from another black man in South Africa's lived experience, because we all have different experiences inside of us. And it's so important that we share those experiences. And I think the danger is that we all start saying, oh, yes, I know how you feel. I don't know how you feel, because I've never been a black man in South Africa or living in Europe as a migrant. Of course, I don't know how you feel. And you don't know you don't know what it feels like to be heard, seen, and listened to. And that's kind of at the core of what we have to address as a society. And also accept that is the situation. And accepting that is the situation is the first step to changing that situation, of acknowledging that happens. And there is a lot of people that will not acknowledge that you don't have a voice. There is a lot of people that will still say, "Oh, you're exaggerating," and it's not. We have to, yeah. Sorry, I get very passionate about it because it's so important. If we're going to change the world and you have a little baby, if we're going to change the world for that younger generation, then we have to start listening to each other. Yeah, but really listening, not just hearing, listening.
I think that's one skill that we need to also needs to add into a lot of layers, the skill of listening, because I find that in especially now that we've living our life in a social platform on cell phones and laptop, we always listen to reply and not necessarily listen to understand the depth of the conversation, but just to reply to the situation, become defensive of issues that are there and we see.
Absolutely. I think there is a defensiveness from people that we have to break down. There's an American business writer, Brené Brown, who talks about vulnerability, and we have to take off this. We have to take off this armor, this covering, and be open and reveal ourselves. And it's okay. That's okay. But if we don't, then we're stuck with this tension all the time.
Yeah, and I think it is really important to create places where we're able to, you mentioned it earlier, like the word representation, and I think that is so important. Trying to help others that might not be listened to, having the option of like expressing themselves, like on a personal level, I also feel like I can really relate to all the things you said, since I'm also working in like more like the caretaking / like leisure time, free time, vacational part for like people with disabilities. And I've been often approached as like, oh, your work is such a noble work, while in fact, I feel like most of the time when I go on vacation, for example, with a group of adults that have like certain or different disabilities, I'm always the one learning so much. Like I learn how, like I improved my skill of like being able to take different point of views, and to have like it's such an enlightening work for me that I don't feel like it is novel at all, because I feel like in fact they're doing some novel work with me, and not the other way around.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Yeah, absolutely. And that's what inclusion should be, is about learning from each other at its heart, but not picking and choosing who we're going to learning from each other total, not picking our role models, but letting the honest conversation and the learning happen through interaction.
Yeah, I think that is, I like that. That's why I'm so happy, and we very much appreciate you taking your time for us and with us this morning to just connect and to create like an opportunity of talking about all of these sometimes maybe uncomfortable topics, but it is really important to stay in conversation to create exchanges.
It is. And for me, when I have a conversation like this, I learn a bit more about what I do, because I have to articulate it. And when you have to articulate it, you learn a bit more. And that's when you have to put it out in the world, when you have to put it in the ether, the airways, then you learn. If you're listening to yourself, quite often we don't listen to ourselves. There's another problem. Good. Well, thank you very much. If you want to learn more about Chickenshed, really feel free to drop me an email anytime. It is easy, and I, as you can tell, it's a passion that we all have, and I'm just one of many people at Chickenshed. So I happen to be the echo chamber for Chickenshed today, but it could have been a number of any other people that would have spoken to you, and you would have got the same passionate response, because it's our life. Yeah.